My name is David Brooks. I write the Granite Geek column for the Concord Monitor, and I've been a moderator of science cafes here and in Nashua for almost 7 years, which is hard to believe. So let me go through my spiel. So first of all, let me ask, how many of you have never been to a science cafe before? Excellent, excellent. So how many of you decided to come just today? And how many of you decided to come because you read a brilliantly written piece in the Concord Monitor? Okay. So, all right, excellent.
Went on to the second page.
There's a jump. All right. So, well, let me give you the spiel. So, Science Cafe was started by a couple of science fans named Dan Marchek and Sarah Eck. Sarah was actually a panelist last month on our session about cancer. They basically knew about these things and wanted to start one up in New Hampshire. And so they ran into each other and decided to do it. They asked me to help out. And we started up here in the Barley House, moved down to Nashua because I was working for the Nashua Telegraph, stayed down there. And now I have come to the Monitor a couple years ago and I started to here, but it is also still running in Nashua. And in fact, the Nashua Cafe is tonight. Usually we're on different weeks, but Thanksgiving sort of messed up schedules, so we're on the same night. And since we have started, we have spurred, there are now 2 other ones going. Sea Science Center in Manchester runs one, and there's also one out in Portsmouth, the Piscataqua. It's at one of the breweries out there. They have one. So I like to say that New Hampshire has the highest per capita rate of science cafes in the country, and I think I actually think that's true. I only know of a couple of them running in Mass. There's probably one out at UMass Amherst that I don't know about, but anyway, so it's good. So the format is extremely informal. What will happen is I will ask the panelists to introduce themselves. I will ask the first question, and after that, it's up to you to ask questions. No question is too obtuse or too simple to ask, and if you don't ask anything, it gets really awkward and embarrassing. Couple of things. One is this is a difficult venue for the wait staff, as you're probably already noticing, because we're very crowded. We all come at the same time. We all leave at the same time. So tip generously. It's Science Cafe. You can do large percentages in your head. Another thing is there's a table right by the door. And there are 2 things on it. One is you can sign up for our email newsletter to just alert you when cafes are coming. And I will also sign you up for the Granite Geek weekly newsletter that you can unsubscribe from if you have no taste. And there is also a special offer for the Monitor for those of you who are non-subscribers, but of course you should be, 50% off for some set period of time. So you can grab that sheet and use that if you want to subscribe. I think that's it. The only rule here is no politics, and I reserve the right to stop any talk about Northern Pass because we're all sick of hearing about it. All right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask the 3 sometimes in the past I've introduced the panelists and then asked them to also introduce themselves, and frankly it seems kind of repetitive. So I think I'm just going to ask the 3 of you to take the microphone there. Oh, microphone. We will be bringing microphones around when you ask questions. So this is like school. Please raise your hand and wait for us to come over with a microphone. And the reason for that is that Concord Television, the community access channel, is filming this. And so they need the audio. And it will be online. So if your friends, somebody wanted to come and couldn't see it, in about a week they'll have it up. And it will stay on the internet so you can come see it. But so raise your hand and wait for us to come over. When the microphone comes, ask your question into the microphone, and the line is to pretend it's like you're eating an ice cream cone and have it closer to your mouth than you think it needs to be, because people tend to ask questions like this. So, and if you're Italian, don't do this while you're talking. All right. Okay, I think that's it. So, microphone, we'll start here. Give us 3 minutes to say who you are and why we should pay any attention to you whatsoever, and then hand it off.
Thank you, David. My name is Jim Brennan. I am the Director of Finance at the New Hampshire Office of Consumer Advocate. My background is split evenly between finance and technology. I was originally a commercial banker in New York, performing a lot of analysis there, financial analysis. Moved to technology at Waterhouse Securities, got into developing software and managing technology projects. At the Office of Consumer Advocate, for those that don't know what that office does, is we intervene in energy dockets at the Public Utility Commission, which includes water dockets, natural gas cases, and a lot of electric dockets. And I've been involved in dockets regarding infrastructure planning, grid modernization, which is pertinent to tonight's conversation, and look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Good evening, all. My name is Mike Moyman.
Okay, maybe you don't need to hold it quite so close.
I probably don't even need the microphone, but yes, I'm a professor at Franklin Pierce University, where I run the Energy and Sustainability MBA program. My background is born and raised in South Africa, as you can tell from the accent. I am an engineer by training, worked in the corporate world for about 20 years, and picked up a lot of finance on the way. And I like to work at the intersection of finance and technology and regulation, and quite frankly, that's where energy happens. And it's one of the fundamental, concepts I drive into the students, that no energy project happens without all those three things working in concert. It's the technology, the finance, and the regulatory environment. I've always had a great interest, even as an engineer, in the sort of energy aspects of engineering, and I've been fortunate to actually take that and make it my teaching profession and my research interests as well. I'm the author of the Energy in New Hampshire blog, and I really like to look at New Hampshire energy issues. New Hampshire is a very unique place to study energy issues. It's small and it's complicated at the same time. I've also had the good fortune the past couple of years to go study energy issues in developing countries. I managed to spend a year in Botswana looking at solar power in that country. So I've sort of seen energy from the developed world point of view, as well as from the developing country point of view. So it's, I have a good sense of what works and what doesn't work in different environments. But as anything else, there's an incredible amount to learn in this field, and that's one thing I love about energy, is I'm always learning. And with that, turn on to Chris.
All right, thank you very much. My name is Chris Coghlan. I'm the Climate and Energy Program Manager at the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services. I've been with the department for about 10 years, which compared to my previous career history it's been an eternity. Prior to working at the department, I had 26 different jobs. I got into med school, decided I didn't want to go, worked in outdoor education at the Sargent Center for Outdoor Ed, which many of you may have sent some of your children to or actually have gone. After that, I went into farming, didn't like that, went into healthcare a little bit, went back into being a wait staff, went back into education. I taught 6th, 7th, and 8th grade for a year, went back into outdoor education. And basically, I spent a lot of time reinventing myself. And so when it came time for me to join at New Hampshire DES, I actually arrived there because I'd been teaching students, and we got into a unit on climate change, and I realized that if I wanted to really take care of the kids, I needed to get into an education. I needed to get involved in addressing climate change and its impacts, and sort of backed into energy through that. Took me a few years to find my way to New Hampshire DES, but my background in kind of reinventing myself, but also into kind of carrying student groups or even just a group out in the woods, carrying them through a ropes course, ended up being how I got into leading the state's development of its first climate action plan, which some of you are involved in. It's actually why I'm deliberately undercutting all of my expertise, because some of the people in this room know more about this subject than I do. Penty, I'm looking in your direction. But then after that, I went on and I've been involved in integrating climate kind of into all different levels of New Hampshire state government, whether it's within our agencies, helping support local energy committees, and then more recently I've started to work with the New England governors and Eastern Canadian premiers to look at how we can be addressing energy and climate planning as an entire region, recognizing that energy doesn't stop at the border, nor do our cars. NHPR pointed out today that 8 million visitors will come to the state in this winter alone. So we need to be looking at how we manage energy kind of in an integrated fashion. And that's kind of what brought me into kind of looking at our grid modernization efforts. So I look forward to your questions.
All righty. Well, I am gonna slightly modify this and say the panelists can hold their microphones further away from their mouth, but chances are you all can't. All right. So I'm going to ask the first question, and we'll start with the overview. So we've had science cafes before about energy sources, you know, solar power or nuclear power. But this is talking about the grid and how to what the grid is and how to modernize it. So let's start with a very quick overview. I'll start with you in the middle, and about what is the grid? What is a power grid?
You know, I think it's rather unfair of David to put a professor in front of an audience without PowerPoint and without a whiteboard, really. But I will attempt. You know, when I think of the grid, I think of three components. I think of the generating facilities, whether it be nuclear power plants such as Seabrook, whether it be the coal-fired plant down the road, or the Amherst-Keg hydro facility that I see outside of my office down in Manchester. That's the generating part. Then, of course, there's the transmission part of the grid. Those are the high-tension wires that are much discussed and much under debate, of course, in New Hampshire at this time with Northern Pass. So those are all the large high-tension wires of tall towers we see. And then the third component of the grid is the distribution. When those large high-tension lines get delivered to our communities, they go through a series of transformers, down the wires and into our homes. So there are those three components of the grid that are equally important. It's the generation side, it's the transmission side, and of course the distribution side.
And our grid ends at the border and we have no connection to other states?
That is incorrect. From the Public Utility Commission standpoint, they regulate distribution companies, PSNH, Granite State Electric. That's within the state border, but the entire grid is interconnected. I did work as a smart grid analyst and wanted to comment on Michael's explanation of the parts of the grid, which is excellent. NIST published a report, actually lengthy
NIST.
analysis, National Institute of Standards and Technology. And fascinating, it's about a 300-page analysis of the grid, and they went through and tried to define what the grid is, and they break it down into 8 domains that allow lay people like me discuss it, and they are the generation, transmission, distribution. They also call out the customer domain, the markets domain, and the third-party providers domain. And all of these 8 domains are all connected with the power lines, but they are also increasingly becoming connected with communication infrastructure, which we might talk about with regard to grid mod.
You want to say anything? Or you?
And I guess increasingly what we're seeing is that there's been a shift away from what I would look at as kind of my parents' grid, which is where they're taking electricity in one direction, and they're using it, and their house is lit up like it's Christmas all the time. All the lights are on, whether they're in it or whether they're home, because my mom believes the cats, they need light to see. Whereas in my home, we're increasingly rigging the house so that we're installing our second set of solar panels. So we are both a consumer of energy, but we're also, there's a new term, I believe it's prosumer, where we're producing energy and feeding it back onto the grid when we don't need it. But we're also going to be integrating in a year or less an electric vehicle, and that's why we're having a second set of solar panels put on. In the future, what New Hampshire DES is actually considering is that those vehicles won't just be taking electricity, but they could actually be distributed energy resources themselves, so that it's called V2G, vehicle to grid, that they could serve as a storage source, so when the grid needs it, energy could come off. So the grid is becoming increasingly complex and moving away from that central generation, which I think is more of what we've thought about it in the past.
Yeah, it was really boring in the past. It would not be a good Science Cafe topic in the past. All right, that's it. It's up to you. Whoa, Steve is going to come around. Well, he'll...
Okay, you're the lucky one.
And raise your hands again each time, and I'll come to you eventually. You don't need to keep them up the whole time.
Because it's so confusing in terms of the way the grid is regulated, could you say us something a little bit about capacity and spinning reserves and how that, dials into the types of decisions that are being made about the need to expand or not expand transmission?
Yes, I think Dick is really also referring to the sort of generation aspect of the grid. But we've seen a lot of grid changes happening because we have a lot more renewables now being fed onto the grid. We have a lot of wind projects in Maine that are coming online, and our transmission system isn't set up to draw the energy from some of those new projects that have been set up. So as a result, we have to expand the grid, we have to modernize the grid in order to deliver that energy, of course, into the metropolitan centers that many of us live in. So that's certainly one of the reasons that our grid is being modernized at the moment. But Dick, maybe I don't quite follow your question. What are we looking for in terms of spending reserves?
Part two.
Sorry. I was thinking more in terms of the capacity factors. So, I mean, you take Merrimack, which is being sold, which probably won't run more than 9 or 10%, but somebody's still making money on the capacity factors, and that's confusing. And then the other one I missed, we can skip spinning reserves for now, but the other thing I missed was storage going forward, which Chris referred to, and what kinds of changes that's going to make in terms of peak versus base load and stuff like that.
Whoa. Okay, that's pretty much a deep dive into the entire topic in the first question. So there you go.
And I'm not going to probably go as deep as Dick might want to go, because I think one of the things that I want to make sure that everyone understands is that the grid is kind of like on almost the grid naturally fluctuates. Lights go on and off, but there can be things that cause spikes in demand, and so the grid needs to be responsive to that. We need to be able to have energy generation match and follow load. And so we actually have ISO New England, which will prepare a day in advance and try to make sure that there's enough generation assets to meet the amount of electrical load to generate the electricity that we need to function. So they're looking at weather factors, they're looking at what time of year is it, what's the amount of daylight that we would see during the year, so that they have queued up the right number of facilities to meet that load. And one of the things that Bow or Merrimack Station hasn't been running as much, but it still is available in case ISO New England needs it to meet the entire grid. Anyone that read David's article today, he was talking about a bathtub. The electricity generation is all feeding electricity onto the wires, and it's almost like it's a giant bathtub. We as individual homeowners are kind of sipping out of that bathtub with straws. But I think the point that I'm trying to make is that Merrimack needs to be there because there are some times during the summer or during very cold periods when we know that our load or electricity demand is going to be so high that we need that one facility to run maybe once a year. It's very expensive for it to run because it needs to, stay in business for the whole rest of the year, so it has to make enough money. So we have various amounts of assets that we need to have on hand. Does that get close to what you're talking about, or? Yeah.
Since you brought up the bathtub analogy, and I work at the Consumer Advocate, that was Don Crease's analogy, which I thought was interesting, but it really ties into the capacity factor issue, which is one of the fundamental problems that exists with our grid today, is the low capacity factor. So in that analogy with the bathtub, the tub itself is the grid infrastructure, the wires, the poles, the substations, the generators. And the water in the tub is the electricity, the kilowatt hours. The problem is in that tub today, there's only like an inch or two of water in the bottom of a deep tub. Only for a small time is that tub filled with water. It's low capacity factor. So shift to maybe a better analogy, which is airlines. I analyzed airline companies when I was at the bank. They had this metric called a load factor. Same thing. You walk onto an airplane, has 100 seats in it, and there's only 20 people in it, which is great for us. But that 20% load factor is a major issue, and airlines used to run that way. I mean, they're paying for, why do they have a plane that has 100 seats in it? Because every now and then, they fill those seats up. So they build over capacity. The airlines got smart, and through pricing and through marketing and analyzing routes, you don't get on a plane anymore with 80 empty seats. They're usually filled. Their load factors are high. It helps profitability. Problem with the grid is that the capacity factor is, you mentioned Merrimack, maybe 20%. It could be even lower. And that's not highly unusual. There's a lot of generation that just sits idle, except for those peak needs. And what has to happen, hopefully, through a lot of things we're talking about, is we're going to bring the capacity factor of the grid from whatever it is today, 20, 30%, we want to bring it up to 50%, 75%. And when that happens, you're sharing all those costs with more people, and it's a much more sustainable situation. So capacity factor is a key end result of bringing on a lot of grid modernization efforts that we can talk about how that will occur.
Okay, I'll get one in the middle. Can I just actually, before I get to you, let me ask one question. What is the fluctuation in the amount of electricity that New England uses from like the lowest day of the year to the highest day of the year? Double?
It's about double. I think on the lowest day of the year, it might be about 14,000 megawatts or 14 gigawatts. And I think at the highest it's ever been peak load, summertime is about 28.
I'll start with you.
Thank you for coming to help us understand some of these things. And can I ask us sort of a technical question? In the Northern Pass thing, they were talking about direct current coming a long ways down and then being transferred into an alternating current. Does direct current lines run hotter or colder, or do the alternating current lines run hotter or colder? It strikes me that if you're talking about putting some of these power lines in the ground, and I was playing around with Google Earth, and I noticed in Europe there's not a whole lot of power lines that are above ground. They seem to be all buried in Europe. Looks like it's the way to go. But do they produce heat that would create a problem? Oh, I gotta stop doing that.
And you could maybe talk briefly about DC versus AC. What they are.
I'll focus on that, is that, and I'm not an engineer, but DC is apparently a very efficient way to transmit power, and that's why they're bringing 1,000 megawatts of power through DC lines. And I know for a fact that transmission does create heat. You see these stories of the transmission lines sagging between towers. So it's just an example of some of the inefficiencies that do exist actually within the grid when you're talking about transmitting power long distances. I think you lose 6% of energy in transmission in our grid. As far as generation, I think we lose around, I don't know, I think it's like almost 60% of the energy in converting fossil to energy is lost right in a generation plant. So there is a lot of inefficiencies.
And it gets changed back to AC because that's what we use.
Yeah, that's AC powering our appliances in our homes.
All right, well, I told the panelists I'd let them go by 8 o'clock no matter, even though I still have questions here. But I do want to say, you talk about efficiency not being sexy. I remember when they put a 50 kilowatt solar panel array at Stonyfield Yogurt, and it was at the time the largest in the state. And so we all came out and took pictures of it. And the CEO, what's his name, Gary something or other, yes, was talking about, and he's saying, well, actually, last year we put X amount of insulation in our freezer and it's saving us 18 times as much power as this thing, but you guys won't come out and take pictures of insulation. And that's quite correct. Who brags about, hey, I got extra insulation in my attic, but if you got panels on your roof, you talk about it incessantly, right? Okay. Anyway, it's 8 o'clock, so let us give our panelists a very big hand. And let me mention your blog again.
EnergyInNewHampshire.com.
EnergyInNewHampshire.com is an excellent blog, although he doesn't post frequently enough. I believe he's been told to, but he doesn't. And don't forget the Outside In podcast talking about Hydropower Quebec. And if you are not a subscriber, you fool, pick up one of these on the way out and you can get a nice cheap rate and or sign up for the... We do not have a December... we skipped December because Christmas is complicated. We will be back in January. I don't know what the subject is yet, but get the mailing list and you'll find out. Thank you very much for coming.